Good afternoon, everyone, and all of my friends in internet land. It is I, Glenn Kyle, with the Northeast Georgia History Center. Glad to be with you again today. We want to bring you a really interesting story today, and this is one that a lot of folks don't think about, a lot of folks don't talk about, and there's not that many books and things out there. But of course, there were African Americans around during the time of the American Revolution. There were tens of thousands of them that were here in the colonies that were going to become independent states. Most of them were enslaved, all of them were not. It's a very interesting mix, and you have to consider how things have been in the United States leading up to that. Slavery had entered the United States very early in the colony of Virginia, and even here in Georgia. There were attempts to prevent the spread of slavery into the colony of Georgia when it was something that the trustees were trying to build. The trustees wanted Georgia to be sort of a yeoman farmer utopia and had in its charter forbidden the importation, ownership, or use of slaves. But of course, once the trustees lost the charter to the colony and it reverted back to the crown as a royal colony, that changed very quickly, and Georgia quickly became like the other southern colonies and began to use the institution of slavery as a form of labor, primarily for agricultural purposes. And again, tens of thousands of enslaved Africans came to this country against their will and were forced into involuntary servitude. But I want you to remember that these are still people, and we have a great video I want you to show that gives just two examples. Here, local Georgia examples of men who were involved in the American Revolution, men of color, and each one of them chose a different side. So please watch this video. We'll be back after the video to take some questions and provide some context. But within the video, you're going to see some different perspectives and how things may not always be as clear-cut as you may think. Let's go to the show.
In the American Revolution, both the British and American governments and their armies viewed enslaved persons as mere pawns, to be used, rewarded, or sacrificed as needed to win the war. When British soldiers captured rebel plantations, they divided up the spoils, including the slaves. When Patriot soldiers captured Loyalist plantations, they did the same. As roving bands of both Patriots and Loyalists plundered and pillaged throughout the countryside in the latter years of the war, they commandeered all slaves they could find for their personal use or sale. Official proclamations on both sides cajoled, threatened, promised, and implied, attempting to sway the enslaved population to their side, each side claiming to have the slaves' best interest at heart, while in reality trying to manipulate them for their own purposes. Faced with competing and contradictory claims on their loyalties and abilities, who were the enslaved people to trust? Who were they to believe? And what action were they to take based on the situation at hand? We cannot say the enslaved believed the Patriots and sided with them, or the enslaved believed the British and sided with them, for one simple, inescapable fact. The enslaved people of America weren't a single unthinking body, easily led. They were individual men and women who, despite their condition of involuntary servitude, retained their ability to think their own thoughts, make up their own minds, and take the actions they felt best for themselves, regardless of what white society on either side wished them to do. Of choices made and not made, guided by their own reasoning and the situation at hand, let us now hear some of the long, silent, enslaved voices of the American Revolution speak.
I remember, it was back in late December of '78. I had been sent down to Savannah to pick up goods that my old master, Mr. George Galpin, had secured for his trading post in the Creek lands between the Flint and Chattahoochee rivers. Mr. Ray and Mr. Dunham had sent some of their people along to pick up goods and share the lading. There had been talk from Savannah up to Augusta and into the back country for a while about the British raids that kept coming up from East Florida. But the Georgia militia and the Continental regulars couldn't agree on a course of action. Well, the British made the decision for them when they landed troops 2 miles south of the city. Outnumbered 3 to 1, those rebel Americans lost the city pretty quick. From what I hear, thanks in no mean way to a Negro from Savannah who showed the King's soldiers a path around the defenses. Now, when that happened, we had to get our loaded wagons out of the city as fast as could be and get on the road back up to Augusta, with the British on our heels the whole way. Now, riding in the wagon with me were Andrew, belonging to Mr. Ray, and John, belonging to Mr. Dunham. The three of us each knew about Lord Dunmore's proclamation that promised the freedom of slaves to American rebels who left their owners and joined the royal forces. We were the last in line on the road, so we fell into examining what chances we might hazard in the present circumstance. I looked at Andrew and John, flat out said, I'm running to the British. What y'all gonna do? And then Andrew, he was driving the wagon. He says, what we gonna do? First thing we gonna do is think, which looks like you done skipped over doing. Dunmore made that proclamation in Virginia. In case you ain't noticed, we in Georgia. Besides that, what if you get caught by the Americans trying to reach the British? What if you get captured serving with the British? What if you catch the smallpox from the soldiers, like so many do? What if the British sell you down to the West Indies, like we heard has happened to some? What if the British don't win, and they got to give you back, and you got to face punishment for running? John just looked at Andrew, shook his head, rolled his eyes, and said, what if? I got no need for what if. I got no time for what if. Now, there ain't much sure in this world, and there might not be anything sure in it. But I never had a chance good as this to be free, and there's no way to know if I'm to have another. Day in, day out, a slave don't ever have a chance, don't ever have a choice. Now we got both. I'm taking them. John and me looked at Andrew. He didn't give a reply. Just gave us both a glance, and then matter-of-factly eased back on the reins. John and me straightened up. As the horses responded by slowing down, Andrew shook his head, whistled, and said, looks like these horses are played, and with them redcoats not too far behind. Then he smiled and said, oh well. And that's how it came that we went to the British. They received us readily, and I began to feel the happiness of liberty, of which they knew nothing before. Now, that ain't to say I didn't see some of what Andrew had worried on. I saw men dying of smallpox and camp fever. I saw some that thought they were getting freedom sold off. I saw some captured away from the British. But Andrew, John, and me, and thousands others, come through it all, free, thanks to the British. Now, you may have noticed in my story, I mentioned Andrew and John by name, but haven't told you my own name. Well, that's because that story's from when I was enslaved. When I left behind slavery, I left behind my slave name. So I am honored to introduce myself to you by my new name, the name I chose. I am British Freedom. It has been 10 years since the Battle of Kettle Creek back in '79, when we Patriots of Georgia militia decisively defeated and scattered a loyalist militia force that was on its way to British-controlled Augusta. I well remember the day, the chill February morning air, the thin light of the winter sun, crashing volley of the musket fire with its flash and smoke, and the boom of our cannon, which I served as crew on. On that cold day, we had hot work, with our cannon keeping the loyalists in place with shot after shot while our soldiers surrounded them. Of course, the enemy didn't just sit there. They fired back as well, and I took a shot to the thigh, causing a wound that has given me pain and disability since. I was the only Negro wounded that day, because I was the only one of my race on the field of battle. Though other Negroes did fight at other battles, and as a slave, I shouldn't have been fighting at all. So you could well ask how I came to be at that battle. It was on account of my master, Richard Aycock of Wilkes County, Georgia. You see, in the late 1770s, he was ordered to report for military service, and he did not wish to go. At that time, you could hire a substitute to fight in your place. In order to avoid military service himself, Aycock sent me to join the Georgia militia as a substitute. To address objections that I was a slave, Aycock claimed I had been born free. And so was that. I came to be serving as an artilleryman in the Battle of Kettle Creek on February 14th, 1779. As I said, I was severely wounded in the thigh during the fighting, and Giles Harris, a white soldier, took me to his home to care for the wound. It's 1789, 10 years on, and I daily remember Mr. Harris's kindness, because I work for the Harris family to this very day. And not as a slave, but as a free man. For because of my service and battle wound, the Georgia legislature provided the funds to emancipate me, to buy my freedom from my owner, Richard Aycock. They further granted me land, 50 acres, in recognition of my military service during the Revolution, the only Negro Georgia so honored. I can tell you this, however. I'm aware of the curiosity that this war for freedom was waged, in part, by men who denied to others. It is self-evident, and God has given me the faculties to perceive it. And I will tell you this plainly. Though in this world of us, master and slave, black and white, soldiers like Mr. Harris and I have been through this war together. And we have seen together those of my color marching, drilling, fighting, dying, and prevailing. Not as ebony sons of Africa, but as Americans. There are some, like my old owner Aycock, who may have come through this fiery trail unchanged in their opinion on perpetual servitude, on slavery. Such is not the case with others, such as Giles Harris and certain members of the Georgia legislature. I will not undertake to predict the future, but at this moment, in 1789, with a new constitution and a Bill of Rights submitted to the people, I dare allow myself to hope that, ere long, the rest of my race may join me in my condition of liberty. But we shall see.
So as you can see, those are two very different stories of two very different men who made two very different decisions and were thrust into situations that they had to react to and they had to work with. But because of their decision making, because of their particular druthers, they did set their own course eventually. Now, these are two fantastic stories, but they're only two. And you have to remember that there are thousands and thousands of these individual stories that could be told. Unfortunately, the sources we have for African Americans who fought during the time of the American Revolution are incredibly scanty, and we have very little to go on. But we do know that many formerly enslaved people did attempt to escape to the British, enough so that the British did begin to form at least one, perhaps two regiments of colored troops that would fight for the British, and one of them even saw action. The promise was that if you left, this is what British freedom was talking about with Dunmore's proclamation. Dunmore was the governor of Virginia. Again, this is somewhat far removed from Georgia, but his proclamation said that anyone who is enslaved or indentured to someone who is a traitor to the crown, not only should they, but they can run away and release themselves from those bonds, come to the British, where they will eventually be given their freedom if they join British service. And this attracted many, many different folks. We think the numbers are anywhere from 800 to 2,000 men that ran away specifically because of Lord Dunmore's proclamation. We think that there were even more up and down the seacoast folks who ran away because of the promise of British freedom. Perhaps as many as 30 to 40,000 slaves escaped during this time to the British. Now, how are they treated by the British? Again, that varies. As our webisode said, and I want to reiterate and emphasize this, it is very, very difficult to draw broad conclusions for a large proportion of the population. There is so many differences, there are so many individual actions, there are so many personal experiences that happen, and it's hard to pin a this was this way or that was that way. Many of the formerly enslaved who escaped to the British were able to eventually fight on the side of the British. Some of them were indeed re-enslaved by the British and sold to plantations in the West Indies. Some were simply put aboard ships because the British didn't quite know what to do with them, and there they sat. And as the war ended, one of the sticking points of the peace between Great Britain and the new United States was exactly what was going to happen with these enslaved people who had left their masters and gone over to the British side. Even George Washington felt that these people should be returned, not as people, but as property. And this is something that is very foreign to us today. And of course, we know now that this is a very horrible way to see other humans. And many people in the 1770s realized this was a horrible way to see humans. But many who owned slaves saw them first and foremost as property. And you want to maintain the integrity of your property. It's your property, and you don't want someone taking it. So this was, for many slave owners, the position that they held when they were trying to negotiate for the return of not people, but their property. And to the British credit, most British officers refused to even consider this as part of the negotiations. Whatever would happen to many of the escaped slaves that were in British custody, very, very few British officers agreed to have those people turned back over to the colonists. And they, of course, went a variety of different places. Some went to England, many went to the West Indies, some stayed with their former owners. And then, of course, we have the case of Austin Dabney, someone who did fight for the American cause. Not at first. Remember, he was forced to by his master to take his place in the state militia, but he did go and he did fight. And whether we just don't know, because he hasn't left us personal records, was this because of the kindness shown to him by Harris? Was it some deeper feeling that he had for the potential of freedom in the New World? Was it simply that this seemed to be the course laid out for him of least resistance and perhaps the most prosperity? We don't know. We do know that Dabney stayed, as the webisode said, with Harris for more or less the remainder of his life and grew quite close to the family and even to the son. So Harris, I can't remember Harris's first name, but his son, Dabney pays for him to go to law school. Not his dad, but they both worked together for the son to go to law school. And then it is the son's and his new law partner who petitioned the state legislature of Georgia to get Dabney land grants because of his service during the Revolution. He's the only person of African descent who was given land grants for his service during the American Revolution. And upon Dabney's death, he had no direct heirs, but he left all of his lands and all of his property to Harris's young son. So those were incredibly close bonds, not just of patriotism, but of friendship. And they're remarkably strong and they're remarkably inspiring. But again, here we have shown only 2 examples out of thousands and thousands. And one of the main points that we try to get across with this webisode, and one of the main points we want you to understand today, is that while the enslaved were in fact enslaved. They were forced into entire lives, often of involuntary servitude. They were not the robots their masters wanted them to be. They were flesh and blood and soul. And they had their own ideas, even though they might have to keep them hidden. They had their own courses of action that they wanted to take. And they all had their hopes and dreams, and we have to remember that, because that's what makes them individuals, and that's what makes these individual stories, at least the ones that we can find out and know about, so very interesting. So we're going to go ahead and I'll do my best to answer some of your questions if we have some.
So were there ever African-American soldiers before the American Revolution?
The question is, were there African-American soldiers before the American Revolution? A few. It was not very common. Even in the North, even in the northern colonies and then eventually the states, slavery did not take root the way it did in the South, mostly because of some religious background and also because of the topography of the North. It didn't lend itself to large plantations where you needed large bodies of labor to work the land. But even then, most colonies had forbade people of color to serve in the militias for a variety of different reasons. But that doesn't mean that they did not often, pick up a musket and fight, especially, for example, in New England and along the frontiers in the South, when there were lots of violent conflicts between European settlers and Native Americans. People would be fighting all the time. But before the American Revolution, there were no units of African Americans fighting for the British. Now, let me get this real quick, and then we'll get to the next question. During the very, very early part of colonial history and Georgia's colonial history, they fought, of course, against the Spanish. That's one of the reasons Georgia was founded, was as a buffer between the Spanish in what's now Florida and the British colonies of the Carolinas. The Spanish did employ entire regiments of African American troops or colored troops from the West Indies. They would form them into bodies, and one of those groups was at Fort Mose and did inflict a fairly serious defeat on some of Oglethorpe's troops when they were trying to invade Florida. So it's not very common, but it does happen.
Helen wants to know, do we know what the feelings of the white soldiers were to have black soldiers among them?
The question is, what were the feelings of the white soldiers having black soldiers amongst them? The quick and easy answer is it varied from person to person, just like all of these sorts of things. We do have some letters that people are upset because of the racial differences and the racial prejudices that existed during the day. They did not want to serve with troops of African descent. Some of them, even after the war, felt that it was not fair that, for example, Austin Dabney would get the same land grant as a white soldier. That was very bothersome. However, on the other hand, there were many soldiers who felt that anyone fighting for the cause of freedom was someone to be respected. Alexander Hamilton, for all of his other issues and baggage, did write a letter imploring the governors of South Carolina and Georgia to arm slaves and form them into units and give them their freedom for service. Even Austin Dabney, now this is a bit of conjecture on my part, but I don't know if you noticed, but he served on an artillery crew. That means that he was one of the people who helped fire the cannon. An infantryman, they fire their musket. They're on their own. But someone who is operating on an artillery crew has to work together. They have to work very closely, and they have to work as a team. What that tells me is that at least that artillery crew must have accepted Austin as an equal or at least a compatriot, because that cannon crew has to work like clockwork to make the cannon fire effectively. And he was part of that crew. So again, it depends from person to person.
What happened to their families if they left to go with the British? Did they take them with them?
The question is, the enslaved people, if they left to go with the British, did they have to leave their families? Did they take them with them? Again, it varies. We know that some people, first of all, let me back up. Sometimes their families were not as protected as you may think. Of course, they're enslaved people. They technically don't have the rights of family. They could be married, sort of, but owners could split up man, wife, and children on a whim if he wanted to separate them out and sell them. So there's the dangerous instability of family already. From a legal perspective, of course, they were very affectionate. They could be very affectionate for each other, but legally, families did not have, African-American enslaved families did not have much standing. Did they try to take their families with them? Some did. Some escaped as a family group and got into the British lines. As a matter of fact, if memory serves, there is one letter that a British officer writes about he's glad to see the black troops come into their side, but it's very frustrating that they're bringing women and children with them because they can't contribute to the war effort and they're just going to eat up all of our rations. So obviously some of them did bring their families, some of them did not. Some of them might have escaped and thought that we will have an attempt to try to go back and get my family later. And hey, maybe, this is in the middle of the war. We don't know who's going to win. If we can help the Crown win, and if we can help the British win, my service to the British Crown will ensure my freedom, and perhaps that will help me get the freedom of my family as well.
Were the black soldiers in their own company or platoon?
The question is, were black soldiers in their own companies or platoons? Not usually. I'll get to a couple of exceptions, but by and large, especially in the American cause, they were sort of scattered throughout. Some of them actually came with their owners as like servants and things who would pick up a musket if there was distress or if there was a need to. There were a couple of exceptions. So the black troops that joined the British after Lord Dunmore's proclamation, he did form them into, I believe he called it the Ethiopian Regiment. Of course, not all of them were from Ethiopia, but in the late 1700s, Ethiopian was sort of a synonym for black or African. So he formed them into an Ethiopian regiment, and they were given some basic uniforms, they were given weapons, they were given basic training, and they did participate in at least one British battle. The Americans also did have one all-black unit, and I believe it was the state of Connecticut that formed the all-black unit. So there are a couple of notable exceptions, but by and large, at this point, they were segregated if they fought sort of throughout the different forces, especially on the American side.
Were there ever black women who fought?
The question is, were there ever black women that fought? We don't have any records of that, or at least no records that I know of, actually picking up a musket or pulling the lanyard of a cannon and firing weapons to fight. Now, that doesn't mean that they did not contribute to the cause. Of course, if they're going to go to the British side, they may help dig fortifications or cook for the soldiers or things like that. But as far as I know, and my memory serves, and it's not perfect, unfortunately, there's no examples of African-American women actually fighting for either side.
Eden wants to know if there were any freeborn blacks fighting in the Revolution.
The question is, were there any freeborn blacks fighting in the Revolution? There were. Please don't ask me to give specific names or instances, but we do know. Now, of course, freed blacks were a very small proportion of the population, and some of them did not have the same legal standing as a white counterpart, socioeconomic counterpart, but they would be more free to make their own choices as to what they would do. Many of them, as most free white people, especially in the backcountry, chose to just stay out of it as much as they possibly could. This is what people tended to do, especially here in the South and here in the backcountry. Some of them did join one side or the other, but the proportions per unit population of free black people was very small.
Samuel, who's 8, wants to know, why did Lord Dunmore ask for escaped slaves to fight for the British?
That's a good question. The question is, why did Lord Dunmore issue his proclamation, and why did he want the African Americans to come over to his side and fight for the British? A couple of reasons, and unfortunately, humanitarian is pretty far down the list. First of all, it would increase the amount of soldiers he had for his side. That's number one. Number two, it would decrease the amount of manpower for the other side. Of course, if remember, the proclamation is only for slave owners who are in rebellion against the crown. The idea is that if you are pro-British, if you are in favor of the crown, your slaves should stay put. That's not fair to take your property from you if you're supporting the crown. But many people didn't make a difference. If as far as some of the British officers and as far as some of the escaped slaves go, an escaped slave is an escaped slave, and it's hard to pin down exactly where they came from or for what purpose. So that was one of the reasons. One of the reasons was that it would cause a great amount of consternation amongst the upper class of American patriots. It's the upper classes who are going to have the economic wherewithal, who are going to have the money to purchase slaves, especially large numbers of slaves. And so they also tend to be the leaders of the revolutionary movement. So if you can be a thorn in their side and take away some of their wealth and take away some of their ability to resist, you're going to affect the upper echelons and the leadership of the Patriot cause as well. So Dunmore had a lot of these things in mind, but it didn't always work out the way he had hoped, because he got a lot of kickback and a lot of condemnation for issuing this proclamation, also from those who were loyal to the crown, because as I said, the slaves are not necessarily going to care or know what the differences are. Any opportunity to escape to potential freedom is going to be taken, just as you saw with British freedom.
Could an African-American soldier rise in ranks to become like a commander?
The question is, could an African-American soldier rise in the ranks and become a commander? Short answer is no. Even amongst those units I was telling you about, the Ethiopian Regiment and the Connecticut Regiment of colored troops, they were all white officers, and usually they were white sergeants. You might occasionally get someone to rise to corporal, but by and large, they would serve as infantrymen or as privates, and that was the extent of their ability to rise through the ranks.
Were there other races or minorities that also fought that weren't white?
Oh, that's a good question. The question is, were there other minorities or other races that fought during the American Revolution, at least here in the colonies? Honestly, don't know the answer to that. I would have to imagine that there are going to be perhaps a very, very few, perhaps even Asians that have come in, perhaps some those of Eastern European stock and things like that. But by and large, what you have on the North American continent are white people of European descent, English, Irish, Scottish, French, German, maybe some Italians. Some folks of the Jewish faith would also have come over. There was a small Jewish population that had formed in Savannah, Georgia, even, for example. But by and large, it's going to be those of European stock and those of African stock. That is by far the majority of the population.
Did Native Americans fight?
That's a good question. Native Americans did fight during the American Revolution. And this is, oh goodness, Libby, you may have to stop me. This is one of those incredibly complex things. It's a great question because it's so complex. So Native Americans, of course, have been on the North American continent for thousands and thousands of years. And when Europeans began to settle, it severely disrupted their way of life, from families all the way up to villages, all the way up to national level tribes. And so they're going to try to find ways that can sustain their economic and their social and their political independence as much as possible. And that means playing European powers off against each other. And in the early days, that works great because the Native Americans are able to play off the Spanish against the French, against the Dutch, against the English, and even against other Native American tribes. As time goes on and the Spanish are more or less kicked out of most of North America, the French are kicked out during the French and Indian War, the Dutch have to leave New York and New Amsterdam and places like that, it gets down to the British. Well, now that there's a revolution, the Native Americans are able to pick a side between the British and the Americans. And a lot of Native Americans side with the British. And there's one big reason, because the British have more or less promised with their policies that Native American tribes will be left alone and that they will close settlement to the west of the Appalachian Mountains. Americans felt like they fought the French and Indian War specifically for the ability to expand to the west. So they do not like this at all. This is one of those underlying reasons of the American Revolution. They want to expand west. So the Native Americans are going to side with the British. They fight with the British here and there, but wherever they do, they tend to be absolutely crushed by the American Patriots. Even here in the South, the Cherokee rise up and fight for the British, and the American Patriots in the South get so upset with that they form an army of about 3,000 to 4,000 militia and march into the Cherokee country, burning crops, burning towns, and causing a serious starvation, which forces the Cherokee to sign a treaty with the Americans and stop fighting for the British. So Native Americans did fight in the American Revolution, and they had a significant influence and effect on the American Revolution, but as the war goes on, that influence and that participation decreases significantly.
What was the youngest age a soldier could be?
The question is, what was the youngest age a soldier could be? There were sort of rules as to how young you could be. Really what they did, especially in terms of needing manpower, if you were big enough and strong enough, they would more or less take you. Now, they're not going to take 10 or 12 or 13-year-old boys, but when you start getting up into the 16, 17-year-old range, you're going to look old enough so that you can serve. Generally speaking, you are only liable for militia service or to join the Army proper if you were about 18 to 20 years old and you had to be of good physical fitness. But if you're needing a lot of men, you're going to take who you can get. And if that 15 or 16-year-old is big enough and strong enough as an 18 or 20-year-old man, they're going to be able to go in and fight.
What was John Lawrence's role with black soldiers?
Oh, let's see. The question is, what was John Lawrence's role with black soldiers? And I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I don't actually know the answer to that. Okay. We may come back to that in a second.
Yeah. Let's see. Oh, did they get the same rations?
Oh, the question is, did the black troops get the same rations as the whites? Generally speaking, yes. They would shorten rations, as I said, when the escaped slaves went into the British camps. As supplies began to run low, they might have to start issuing them less and less. This was a common practice in war, however. If there was a large body of men and women and children somewhere and rations began to run short, armies tended to cut the rations of the women and children because they're not contributing directly to the fighting ability of the army. They're going to make sure that the actual fighting men get the calories that they need to continue fighting. But by and large, they would have the exact same rations or no rations at all as most other soldiers.
All right, we have some information on John Lawrence.
Oh, okay. Oh, Lawrence of South Carolina. Okay. John Lawrence was a backcountry leader from the American Revolution, and if it's the right Lawrence that I'm thinking of, we have a county in Georgia named for him. Of course, there's a county in South Carolina named for him. He was one of those progressives at the time who saw slavery as a significant evil, and he was in favor of enfranchising the slaves and allowing them their freedom if they fought and giving them weapons, as many as possible, because the slave population of the southern colonies was very significant. It was a huge manpower pool. And if you want to take that manpower pool and effectively use it against an increasingly shrinking British army, you're going to need as many men as possible. So he was very much in favor of using black soldiers, offering them their freedom, and letting them take advantage of it. Now, the problem is he's in South Carolina, and South Carolina is very much a state that relies on slavery for its economy. As a matter of fact, there are more slaves in South Carolina at this point than there are free white people. And at this point, he's more or less shouted down, so to speak, and those ideas are simply not able to take root in the South. As I said, Alexander Hamilton wrote a letter saying the same thing, and all of these were brushed aside.
So, are you familiar with Hercules Mulligan Can you speak about who he was?
I am not familiar with Hercules Mulligan. I do apologize. You may have to Google that one on your own.
It seems like he's a character from the musical Hamilton, so they didn't know if it was a character or a real person.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen Hamilton.
Okay, oh no. And did more soldiers join the British side or the American side? More black soldiers?
So the question is, did more enslaved blacks who had escaped join the British side or the American side? By far, more joined the British side because the British were offering freedom. The Americans were not offering mass freedom to enslaved people. They were offering it one at a time if you signed up or if you became a substitute or something like that. So it's not going to be as attractive a service as the British service is because, like I said, they're offering blanket freedom. Again, when the escaped slaves arrive in these British camps, they begin to realize, there are conditions that are being put onto this. You're not immediately being handed your freedom. For example, for the Ethiopian regiment, they had to join the Ethiopian regiment and they had to serve a set term, which I think was about 2 years or the duration of the war. And at the end of that service, they would be given papers that granted their freedom. But until then, technically, on paper, they were still considered enslaved. So it was sort of a catch-22, but by and large, most of those who escaped went to the British.
Were there black soldiers that were famous or well known at the time?
The question is, were there black soldiers that were famous at the time? Not really. Not really. There were too many white soldiers and white officers who were getting all the glory and getting their names in newspapers and things like that. Now, I can think of one exception, and perhaps he wasn't necessarily a soldier, but he was very, very close to the Revolution. And this is a fellow named Billy Lee. And most of you probably haven't heard of Billy Lee, but he was a slave and he belonged to someone that I'm sure you've heard of, George Washington. And here's the interesting thing. So George Washington has Billy Lee come with him to the war. And George Washington is well known throughout Virginia and many of the colonies as one of the greatest horsemen, especially anywhere, which means he can ride down paths, he can jump over logs and through trees and shrubs and all this sort of thing, and he can go really fast, and he's a great horseman. But there's only one person that can keep up with George Washington, and that's Billy Lee, because Billy Lee has to keep up with him. So Billy Lee accompanies General Washington through the entire war and is literally by his side and in his tent. And was there an affection formed between these two men? We'll probably never know, because personal affection isn't something George Washington wrote in any of his letters. We don't even have letters of personal affection for his wife Martha, really. But these two men serving through a long war together and going through all these hardships together, I have to think that there was something, some sort of bond between them. But to your question, lots of people in the Army knew who Billy Lee was, because everywhere Washington was, he was there.
Did former soldiers end up going to England or to Canada that were loyalists?
Yeah, so many of the escaped slaves who had served as soldiers for the British, what happens after the war? Because remember, the British lose. The British have to recognize American independence, and they have to recognize the independence of all 13 colonies in the Treaty of Paris, which is signed in 1783. This leaves thousands of escaped slaves, of former slaves who are now with the British. What do they do? Do they have a choice? What are the British going to do with them? And as I said, by and large, the British do keep their word to them, at least as far as not turning them back over to be slaves for their previous American owners. As a matter of fact, as I said, George Washington tries to enforce part of this, saying, well, you should give us our property back. And the British officers are, no, we're not doing that, forget it. And so the British have to put all of these people on the boats, and some of them do go to Canada, some of them do go to the West Indies. Some of them go back to England, and it's almost a diaspora. Diaspora is a big fancy word that means a group of people who are forced to go a lot of different directions. And, that might separate families for a short time. It may separate them for forever. But they went a lot of different places. Some of them, again, ended up in slavery. Some of them ended up in poverty. No one was allowed to remain in the army. When the war was over, they were discharged from the fighting forces and sort of had to find their own way. But very, very few, fortunately, were returned to their previous owners.
Were they given the same weapons and uniforms on each side?
The question is, were the black troops given the same weapons and uniforms? As far as weapons goes, generally, yes. Every weapon at this point is a single-shot, muzzle-loading, flintlock musket. That's just the standard infantry weapon, so they're going to be given the same weapon. They may not be given the most newly produced and state-of-the-art flintlock muzzleloader, but they're going to be given the same type of weapon, the same type of ammunition. As far as uniforms go, honestly, it depends upon the availability of the uniforms. Generally speaking, those who joined the British side did not get the classic red uniform that you think of with the red coat soldiers. They just didn't. Those who might join the American forces, remember, a lot of the American forces are just wearing the clothes that they bring with them from home, and that's the uniform that they stay in, especially if they're militia. So, to that line of thinking, yes, they would just have their regular clothes on. When they were formed into units, they were given specific uniforms, and they would have the same uniforms as everyone else who would be in a unit. Sometimes that may not be those fancy regimental coats. For example, the Connecticut troops that I was referring to recently, some of them received coats, some of them received hunting frocks, which is just a big linen overshirt, but they're going to get the same thing as the rest of the soldiers do, as availability can make it.
Was there any kind of cultural shift about, that happened after the Revolution because blacks served?
That's a good question. It's a tough question. The question is, was there some sort of cultural shift that occurred after the American Revolution because so many folks of African descent had actually served? The quick answer is no. As a matter of fact, attitudes, especially in America, attitudes towards slavery almost begin to harden after a certain point because now they're independent, they're free, the American colonies are free of the hand of Great Britain telling them what to do, and so they consider it an economic opportunity, if you will, to expand where slavery is. They're going to expand west. Now they get to do that since the British are not there to stop them. They're going to take the plantation system and enslavement with them as they go to new lands and develop new plantations. And so, no, there's not really a cultural shift based upon the honor of those who did serve for the American cause. There are a couple of small instances, like we saw with Austin Dabney. The legislature did vote him lands. He did call white people friends and associated with them. But as time goes by, as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, things only get worse and worse for enslaved African Americans, not better.
We have a big question. How did the war begin?
Oh my goodness, how did the war begin? Aren't we going to do a couple of webisodes about that, Libba? So yes, if you will hold that question, we're going to do a couple of broadcasts over the next week or two, couple of weeks I think, and we're going to look at how the American Revolution actually began. So if you will hold that question and just be patient with us and keep tuning in, we will answer it.
Yeah, so I think that's all we got.
All right, well, thank you so much. Before I go, I wanted to share with you, for this purpose, I actually have a couple of great books. This one, these from an academic perspective, some of these may not be the most recent. This one's from way back in 1991. It's called Water from the Rock, Black Resistance in a Revolutionary Age by Sylvia Frey. And this is also, that's a very much a social look at everything going on. This book tends to focus more on the military aspects, African Americans in the Revolutionary War. This is by retired Lieutenant Colonel Michael Lee Lanning. They're both really good. If I had to pick one, I would probably pick this one. It has a little bit more military stuff in it. It has a great set of appendices with a lot of the different proclamations, a lot of the different letters and things like that. There's also been a new one that's very recently released that I haven't gotten a copy of yet, called They Were Good Soldiers by John U. Rees, R-E-E-S. So there's not a lot of books about this, but the books that are out there are really good. They really dive into those primary sources. So if you get a chance, check out these books. Like I said, this is a very undertold story, but I think it's incredibly crucial to understand because it's right there at our founding, and it's a critical part of our founding that needs to be considered and included every time we think about the founding of our nation. Well, folks, that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you enjoy these, please, if you can, go to our website and click on that donation button. It's not a requirement, but it always helps us keep going forward and make sure we can keep giving you these programs during our situation that we're in. Tomorrow we're going to be taking a look at the world of Jane Austen, which I know is going to be absolutely fascinating. Marie's going to join us again. But until tomorrow, please everyone stay safe and take care.